Welcome back to your next chapter in the history of Protestantism by James A. Wylie. I'm Nicklas Arthur, and you are listening to Prophecy Reformation Now. Because God-given prophecy is history in advance, it is very important for the Christian to learn about the history of the church that Jesus said he would build, starting about 2,000 years ago when he said, "I will build my church." Only if we truly understand history can we find our place in the prophecy of the Revelation, and perhaps even come to know what must shortly come to pass in our own time as well. So, let us pick up right where we left off last time. Protestantism, then, is no petty cause which stole upon the stage of the world at this supreme hour, and which, introducing itself unbidden and without occasion amongst the great affairs of kings and emperors, was unable from its insignificance to make its influence be felt on the great issues then being determined. This is the only position which some historians of name have been able to find for it. According to them, Charles is the great master spirit of the age. His battles are the great events that constitute its history, and its closet is the source and spring of all those influences that are changing the world and molding the destinies of the nations. How superficial this view is, we need not say. Our history has lifted the veil and placed us in the presence of a mightier power. Protestantism is the master. Charles is but the servant. It is as Protestantism wills that he sheathes or unsheathes the sword, that he makes peace or war. And as it is to serve his interests, so is the emperor lifted up or cast down. So are his arms made resplendent with victory or darkened with disaster and defeat. All men and things exist for the Reformation. It is this power that originates, that controls, and that exhorts the service of all around it. Everyone who has eyes to see and a heart to understand must acknowledge that Protestantism stands at the very center of the field, lifting its head king-like above all other actors, and looking serenely down upon the hosts of its foes. It girds itself with no weapons of war. It leads forth no armed host. It brandishes no battle axe in its defense. Yet it alone is safe. The lightnings flash, and their bolts pass without striking it. The thunder cloud gathers, but rolls away and bursts in another quarter of the sky. The powers that struggle and fight around it are smitten, one after another, first with decadence, and in the end with ruin. But this grand cause is seen marching steadily onward to triumph. France is humiliated. Her sovereign's head is bowed on the field of Pavia, not again to be lifted up with the kingly grace that adorned it of yore. A sudden bolt lays the glory of Rome in the dust, and the queen-like beauty then marred is fated never more to flourish in the same high degree. The mighty empire of Charles V is shattered by the rude shocks it sustains, and before going to the tomb, that monarch is destined to see that consumption of the Spanish power setting in, which was to continue till Spain should become the wreck for which many generations it remained. But as regards Protestantism, its progress is like that of a monarch going to be crowned. Every step carries it into a wider arena, and every year lifts it to a higher platform, till at length, on the 25th of June, 1530, the crowning honor is placed on its brow, in presence of the assembled puissance, spiritual and temporal, of the empire, with the emperor at their head, who, here to assist it at its death, becomes the unintended witness of its triumph. The characteristic of the Reformation as distinguished from primitive Christianity was its power of originating social action. It put forth on nations an influence of a kind so powerful that nothing like it is to be found in any previous age of the world. As the gospel in early times held on its way among nations, it called one individual here and another there to be its disciple. Those whom it thus gathered out of the mass it knit together into a holy brotherhood, an evangelical church. Still, though a great multitude, comprehending men of every kindred and tongue, these disciples remained blended with their several nationalities. They did not stand out before the world as a distinct social and political community. They were a spiritual kingdom only. When the magistrate permitted them the open profession of their faith, they thankfully accepted the privilege. When they were denied it, they were content to die for the gospel. They never thought of combining to demand as a right the open and unchallenged profession of their faith. But the Reformation, by quickening and evolving the social instinct in man, brought with it a new order of things. It gave birth not merely to regenerated individuals like primitive Christianity, but to regenerated societies. No doubt the gospel in the 16th century began where the gospel in the 1st century had begun, with the renewal of the individual, but it did not end there. It called bodies corporate into being. It communicated to them the idea of social rights, and supplied an organization for the acquisition and exercise of these rights. The Reformation thus erected a platform on which it was possible to develop a higher civilization, and achieve a more perfect liberty than the human race had yet known. Even leaving out of view the Christian graces, which formed, of course, the basis of that civilization, the civic virtues now shot up into a stature and blazed forth with a splendor which far transcended anything of the kind that Greece and Rome had witnessed in their short-lived heroic age. Wherever the Reformation came, the world seemed to be peopled with a new race, fired with the love of liberty and with the yet more sacred love of truth. Men performed deeds which brightened the lands in which they were done with their glory. Whatever country it made its home, it ennobled by its valor, enriched by its industry, and sanctified by its virtues. The fens of Holland, the mountains of Switzerland, and the straths of Scotland became its seat, and straightway, though till now rude and barbarous, these regions were illuminated with a glory brighter than that which letters and arms had shed on Italy and France. There it converted burghers and artisans, weavers and tillers of the soil, into heroes and martyrs. Such was the new life which the Reformation gave, and such the surprising and hitherto unknown transformations which it wrought on the world. Under the Reformation, society attained its manhood. The manhood of the individual Christian was reached under primitive Christianity, but the manhood of society was not realized until the Reformation came. Until that time, society was under tutors and governors. Despotism flourished previous to that epoch, as being the only form of government compatible in those ages with the peace and good order of states. Till the Reformation permeated nations with the gospel, they had absolutely no basis for freedom. The two great necessities of states are liberty and order. The gospel is the only power known to man that can bestow these two indispensable gifts. Atheism, by emancipating the conscience from superstitious thraldom, can give liberty, but in giving liberty, it destroys order. Despotism and superstition can give order, but in maintaining order, they extinguish liberty. But Christianity gives both. Inasmuch as it sets free the conscience, it gives liberty, and inasmuch as it rules the conscience, it maintains order. Thus the Reformation, making the influence of the Bible operative over the whole domain of society, was the first to plant in nations a basis for freedom, and along with liberty and order, it bestowed the capacity of a terrestrial immortality. The nations of antiquity, after a short career of splendor and crime, followed each other to the grave. If atheism did not precipitate them into anarchy, and so cause them to perish in their own violence, superstition held them in her chains till they sunk in rottenness and disappeared from the earth. The balance, in their case, was ever being lost between the restraint which conscience imposes and the liberty which knowledge gives, and its loss was ever followed by the penalty of death. But the gospel is able to maintain that balance forever, and so to confer on nations a terrestrial, even as it confers on the individual a celestial, immortality. History is just a second Bible, with this difference, that it is written, not like the first in letters, but in great facts. The letters and the facts, however, are charged with the same meaning. In the first Bible, that written in letters, the Creator has made known the attributes of his character, and the great principles on which he conducts his government of his creatures, and has warned nations that, if they would aspire to greatness and seek to be happy, they must base their power on the principles of truth and righteousness on which he rules the world. In harmony with his government, theirs cannot be otherwise than stable and prosperous. But if they place themselves in opposition to it, by adopting as their fundamental and guiding maxims those principles which he has condemned, they will inevitably, sooner or later, come into collision with his omnipotent and righteous rule, and be broken in pieces by the shock and ground to powder. This great truth we read in the one Bible in words plain and unmistakable. We read it in the other, in those beacons of warning and examples for imitation that rise on every side of us, in this nation overthrown and covered with the darkness of ruin, in that seated on the foundation of truth and rising sublime with the lights of liberty and morality shining around it. 5 lines or 5 words may suffice to announce a great principle, but 5 centuries or 10 centuries may pass away before a nation has made full proof of the truth or the falsehood of that principle. The nation selects it as its cornerstone. It frames its law and policy according to it. Its national spirit and action are simply the development of that principle. It goes on, working out its problem for centuries. The end comes at last. The nation rises, we shall suppose, to wealth, to liberty, to renown. How manifest is it that the principle was true, and that in selecting it the nation chose the better part? Or it brings disaster, disgrace, and overthrow. Equally manifest is it that the principle was false, and that in selecting it the nation chose the worst part. Let us take an instance in illustrating each side of the principle. Spain fallen from the summit of power, her sierras treeless and flowerless, her plains a desert, her towns hastening to decay, her people steeped in ignorance, in poverty, and in barbarism, proclaims the supreme folly of which she was guilty when she chose to rest her greatness upon a conscience governed by the Inquisition. Britain, the seat of law, the sanctuary of justice, the fountain of knowledge, the emporium of commerce, and the bulwark of order and liberty, proclaims not less emphatically the wisdom of her choice when she made her first requisite a conscience emancipated and guided by the Bible. Providence ever sends its instructors into the world, as the first preachers of Christianity were sent into it, by twos. Here we have Spain and Britain. the two great instructors of the world. They differ in that each is representative of a different principle, but they agree in that each teaches, the one negatively and the other positively, the self-same lesson to mankind. They are a tree of the knowledge of good and evil to the nations, as really as was the tree in the midst of the garden of old. How manifest is it that a fertilizing dew has descended upon the one, and that a silent malediction has smitten the other. The Mount Ebal of Christendom, with the curse upon its top, stands over against the Mount Gerizim, from whose summit the blessing, like a star, beams out before the nations. With history's page open before us, we have verily no need that one should demonstrate to us that there is a God, and that the Bible is a revelation of his character and will. The latter truth is continually receiving authentication and fulfillment in acts of righteousness and dispensations of terror for what are the annals of the world and the chronicles of the race, but a transaction into fact of the laws and principles made known in Holy Writ. God in no age and in no land leaves himself without a witness. The facts of history are the testimony of his being and the proof of his word. They are the never-ceasing echo of that awful voice, which at the very dawn of national history proclaimed the attributes of the divine character and the principles of the divine government. From the top of Sinai, in history, that voice is speaking still. We have come to Volume 2 and Book 10, Rise and Establishment of Protestantism in Sweden and Denmark. Chapter 1, Reception or Rejection of Protestantism in Various Countries. Germany. Causes disposing it toward the new movement. Central position. Free towns. Sobriety and morality of the people. Switzerland, the Swiss. Hardy, lovers of liberty, the new liberty. Some accept, some refuse. France, its greatness. Protestantism in France glorified by its martyrs. Retribution. Bohemia and Hungary. Protestantism flourishes there. Extinction by Austrian tyranny. Holland. Littleness of the country. Heroism. Holland raised to greatness by the struggle. Belgium. Begins well, faints, sinks down under the twofold yoke of religious and secular despotism. What we have already narrated is only the opening of the great drama in some of the countries of Christendom. Protestantism was destined to present itself at the gates of all the kingdoms of Europe. There we must follow it, and chronicle the triumphs it obtained in some of them, the defeat it sustained in others. But first let us take a panoramic view of the various countries as respects the state of their peoples and the preparedness for the great spiritual movement which was about to enter their territories. This will enable us to understand much that is to follow. In these opening chapters, we shall summarize the moral revolutions, with the national splendors in some cases, the national woes in others, which attended them, the historical record of which will occupy the pages following. In some countries, Protestantism made steady and irresistible advance, and at last established itself amid the triumphs of art and the higher blessings of free and stable government. In others, alas, it failed to find any effectual entrance. Though thousands of martyrs died to open its way, it was obliged to retire before an overwhelming array of stakes and scaffolds, leaving the barriers of these unhappy countries, as France and Spain, for instance, to be forced open by ruder instrumentalities at a later day. To the gates at which the Reformation had knocked in vain in the 16th century came revolution in the 18th with a tempest of war and bloody insurrections. During the profound night that shrouded Europe for so many centuries, a few lights appeared at intervals on the horizon. They were sent to minister a little solace to those who waited for the dawn, and to give assurance to men that the eternal night, to use the pagan phrase, had not descended upon the earth. In the middle of the 14th century, Wycliffe appeared in England, and nearly half a century later, Huss and Jerome arose in Bohemia. These blessed lights, welcome harbinger of morn, nay, that morn itself, cheered men for a little space, but still the day tarried. A century rolls away, and now the German sky begins to brighten, and the German's plain to glow with a new radiance. Is it day that looks forth, or is it but a deceitful gleam, fated to be succeeded by another century of gloom? No, the times of the darkness are fulfilled, and the command has gone forth for the day to shine in all its glory. Both the place and the hour were opportune for the appearance of the Reformer. Germany was a tolerable central spot. The great lines of communication lay through it. Emperors visited it at times. Imperial diets were often held in it, which brought there in crowds princes, philosophers, and scribes, and attracted the gaze of many more who did not come in person. It had numerous free towns in which mechanical arts and burial rites flourished together. Other countries were at that moment less favorably situated. France was devoted to arms. Spain was wrapped up in its dignity, and yet more in its bigotry, which had just been intensified by the presence on its soil of a rival superstition, Islam namely, which had seized the fairest of its provinces and displayed its symbols from the walls of the proudest of its cities. Italy, guarded by the Alps, lay drowned in pleasure. England was parted from the rest of Europe by the sea. Germany was the country which most largely filled the conditions required where the second cradle of the movement would rise. In its sympathies, sentiments, and manners, Germany was more ecumenical than any other country. It belonged more to Christendom, and was moreover the connecting link between Asia and Europe, for the commerce of the two hemispheres was carried across it, though not wholly so now, for the invention of the mariner's compass had opened new channels for trade and new routes for the navigator. If we consider the qualities of the people, there was no nation on the continent so likely to welcome this movement and to yield themselves to it. The Germans had escaped, in some degree, the asceticism which had emasculated the intellect, and the vice which had imbruted the manners of the southern nations. They retained to a large extent the simplicity of life which had so favorably distinguished their ancestors. They were frugal, industrious, and sober-minded. A variety of cause had scattered among them the seeds of a coming liberty, and its first sprouting were seen in the interrogatories they were beginning to put to themselves. Why should it be necessary to import all of their opinions from beyond the Alps, where the people were neither better, braver, nor wiser than themselves? They could not understand why nothing orthodox should grow save in the Italian soil. Here, then, marked by many signs, was the spot where a movement whose forces were stirring below the surface in many countries was most likely to show itself. The dissensions and civil broils, the din of which had distracted the German people for a century previous, were now silenced, as if to permit the voice that was about to address them to be the more distinctly heard and the more reverentially listened to. From the German plains we turn to the mountains of Switzerland. The Swiss knew how to bear toil, to brave peril, and to die for liberty. These qualities they owed in a great degree to the nature of their soil, the grandeur of their mountains, and the powerful and ambitious states in their neighborhood, which made it necessary for them to study less peaceful occupations than that of tending their herds, and gave them frequent opportunities of displaying their courage in sterner contests than those they waged with the avalanches and tempests of their hills. First it was France, and then it was Austria which attempted to become master of their country, and its valorous sons had to vindicate their right to independence on many a bloody field, a higher liberty than that for which the Tell had contended, or the patriots of St. Jacob and Morat had poured out their blood, now offered itself to the Swiss. Will they accept it? It only needed that the yoke of Rome should be broken, as that of Austria had already been, to perfect their freedom, and it seemed as if this happy lot was in store for this land. Before Luther's name was known in Switzerland, the Protestant movement had there broken out, and under Zwingli, whose views on some points were even clearer than those of Luther, Protestantism for a while rapidly progressed. But the stage in this case was less conspicuous, and the champion less powerful, and the movement in Switzerland failed to acquire the breadth of the German one. The Swiss mind, like the Swiss land, is partitioned and divided, and does not always grasp a whole subject, or combine in one unbroken current the entire sentiment and action of the people. Factions sprang up. The warlike forest cantons took the side of Rome. Arms met arms, and the first phase of the movement ended with the life of its leader on the fatal field of Kappel. A mightier champion was to resume the battle which had been lost under Zwingli, but that champion had not yet arrived. The disaster which had overtaken the movement in Switzerland had arrested it, but had not extinguished it. The light of the new day continued to brighten on the shores of its lakes and in the cities of its plains, but the darkness lingered in those deep and secluded valleys over which the mighty forms of the Uberland Alps hang their glaciers and snows. The 5 forest cantons had led gloriously in the campaign against Austria, but they were not to have the honor of leading in this second and greater battle. They had fought valorously for political freedom, but that liberty which is the palladium of all others they knew not to value. To France came Protestantism in the morning of the 16th century, with its demand, "Open, that I may enter." But France was too magnificent a country to become a convert to Protestantism. Had the great kingdom embraced the Reformation, the same century which witnessed the birth would have witnessed also the triumph of Protestantism. But at what a cost would that triumph have been won? The victory would have been ascribed to the power, the learning, and the genius of France, and the moral majesty of the movement would have been obscured, if not wholly eclipsed. The author of Protestantism did not intend that it should borrow the carnal weapons of princes, or owe thanks to the wisdom of the schools, or be a debtor to man. A career more sublime was before it. It was to foil armies, to stain the glory of philosophy, to trample on the pride of power, but itself was to bleed and suffer, and to go onwards, its streaming wounds, its badges of rank, and its sprinkled raiment, its robe of honor. Accordingly, in France, though the movement early displayed itself, and at once and again enlisted in its support the greater part of the intelligence and genius of virtue of the French people, it would never become Protestant. The state remained Roman Catholic all along. For the short period of equivocal policy on the part of Henry IV is no exception, but the penalty exacted, and to this day not fully discharged, was a tremendous one. The bloody wars of a century, the destruction of order, of industry, and of patriotism, the sudden and terrible fall of the monarchy amid the tempests of revolution, formed the price which France had to pay for the fatal choice she made at that grand crisis of her fate. Let us turn eastward to Bohemia and Hungary. They were once powerful Protestant centers, their proud position in this respect being due to the heroism of Huss and Jerome of Prague, sanctuaries of the Reformed faith, in which pastors, holy in life and learned in doctrine, ministered to flourishing congregations, rose in all the cities and rural districts. But these countries lay too near the Austrian Empire to be left unmolested, as when the hot wind passes over the plain, brushing from its surface with its hot breath the flowers and verdure that covers it, and leaving only an expanse of withered herbs, so passed the tempests of Austrian bigotry over Bohemia and Hungary. The Protestantism of these lands was utterly exterminated. Their sons died on the battlefield or perished on the scaffold. Silent cities, fields untilled, the ruins of churches and houses, so lately the abodes of a thriving, industrious, and orderly population, testified to the thorough and unsparing character of that zeal which, rather than that these regions should be the seat of Protestantism, converted them into a blackened and silent waste. The records of these persecutions were long locked up in the imperial archives, but the sepulchre has been opened. The wrongs which were inflicted by the court of Austria on its Protestant subjects, and the perfidies with which it was attempted to cover these wrongs, may now be read by all, and the details of these events will form part of the sad and harrowing pages that are to follow. The next theater of Protestantism must detain us a little. The territory to which we now turn is a small one, and was as obscure as small till the Reformation came and shed a halo around it, as if to show that there is no country so diminutive which a great principle cannot glorify. At the mouth of the Rhine is the little Batavia. France and Spain thought and spoke of this country, when they thought and spoke of it at all, with contempt. A marshy flat, torn from the ocean by the patient labor of the Dutch, and defended by mud dikes, could in no respect compare with their own magnificent realms. Its quaking soil and moist climate were in meet accordance with the unpoetic race of which it was the dwelling place. No historic ray lighted up its past, no generous art or chivalrous feat illustrated its present. Yet this despised country suddenly got the start of both France and Spain, as when some obscure peak touched by the sun flashes into the light, and is seen over kingdoms, so Holland, in this great morning, illumined by the torch of Protestantism, kindled into a glory which attracted the gaze of all Europe. It seemed as if a more than Roman energy had been suddenly grafted upon the phlegmatic Batavian nature. On that new soil feats of arms were performed in the cause of religion and liberty, which nothing in the annals of ancient Italy surpasses, and few things equal. Christendom owed much, at the crisis of its history, to the devotion and heroism of this little country. Wanting Holland, the great battle of the 16th century might not have reached the issue to which it was brought, nor might the advancing tide of Romish and Spanish tyranny have been stemmed and turned back. Holland had its reward. Disciplined by its terrible struggle, it became a land of warriors, of statesmen, and of scholars. It founded universities, which were the lights of Christendom during the age that succeeded it. It created a commerce which extended to both hemispheres, and its political influence was acknowledged in all the cabinets of Europe. As the greatness of Holland had grown with its Protestantism, so it declined when its Protestantism relapsed. Decay speedily followed its day of power, but long afterwards its Protestantism again began to return, and with it began to return the wealth, the prosperity, and the influence of its better age. We crossed the frontier and passed into Belgium. The Belgians began well. They saw the legions of Spain, which conquered sometimes by their reputed invincibility even before they had struck a blow, advancing to offer them the alternative of surrendering their consciences or surrendering their lives. They girded on the sword to fight for their ancient privileges and their newly adopted faith, for the fields which their skillful labor had made fruitful as a garden, and the cities which their taste had adorned, and their industry enriched with so many marvels. But the Netherlanders fainted in the day of battle. The struggle, it is true, was a sore one, yet not more so to the Belgians than to the Hollanders. But while the latter held out, waxing ever the more resolute as the tempest grew ever the more fierce, till through an ocean of blood they had waded to liberty, the former became dismayed. Their strength failed them in the way, and they ingloriously sank down under the double yoke of Philip and Rome. Chapter 2. Fortunes of Protestantism in Italy, Spain, and Britain. Italy. Shall it be a disciple of the Goth? Pride in the past her stumbling block. Spain. The Moslem dominancy. It intensifies Spanish bigotry. Protestantism to be glorified in Spain by martyrdom. Preparations for ultimate triumph. England. Wycliffe. Begins the new times. Rapid view of progress from Wycliffe to Henry VIII. Character of the king. His quarrel with the Pope. Protestantism triumphs. Scotland. Protestantism crossed the Alps and essayed to gather round its standard the historic nations of Italy and Spain. To the difficulties that met it everywhere, other and peculiar ones were added in this new field. Unstrung by indolence and enervated by sensuality, the Italians had no ear but for soft cadences, no eye but for aesthetic ceremonies, and no heart but for a sensual and sentimental devotion. Justly had its great poet Tasso, speaking of his native Italy, called it this Egyptian land of woe, teeming with idols and their monstrous train. And another of her poets, Guidiccioni, called upon her to shake off her corrupting and shameful languor, but called in vain. Buried in sleep of indolence profound, so many years at length awake and rise, my native land, enslaved because unwise. The new faith which demanded the homage of the Italians was but little in harmony with their now strongly formed tastes and dearly cherished predilections. Severe in its morals, abstract in its doctrines, and simple and spiritual in its worship, it appeared cold as the land from which it had come, a root out of dry ground, without form or comeliness. Her pride took offense. Was Italy to be a disciple of the Goth? Was she to renounce the faith which had been handed down to her from early times, stamped with the approval of so many apostolic names, and sealed with the sanction of so many councils? And in the room of this venerated worship, to embrace a religion born but yesterday in the forests of Germany? She must forget all her past before she could become Protestant. That a new day should dawn in the north appeared to her just as unnatural as that the sun, reversing his course, should rise in that quarter of the sky in which it was his wont to set. Nowhere had Christianity a harder battle to fight in primitive times than at Jerusalem among the Jews. The descendants of the patriarchs, they had the chair of Moses, and they refused to listen to one greater than Moses. They had the throne of David, to which, though fallen, they continued to cling, and they rejected the scepter of him who was David's son and Lord. In like manner, the Italians had two possessions, which in their eyes were of more value than 100 reformations. They had the capital of the world, and the chair of St. Peter. These were the precious legacy which the past had bequeathed to them, attesting the apostolicity of their descent, and forming, as they accounted them, the indubitable proofs that Providence had placed amongst them the fountain of the faith, and the seat of a universal spiritual dominion. To become Protestant was to renounce their birthright. So, clinging to these empty signs, they missed the great substance. Italy preferred her Pope to the gospel. When we cross the Pyrenees and enter Spain, we find a people who are more likely, so one would judge, to give Protestantism a sympathetic welcome. Grave, earnest, self-respectful, and naturally devotional, the Spaniard possesses many of the best elements of character. The characteristic of the Italy of that day was pleasure. Of Spain we should say it was passion and adventure. Love and song filled the one. Feats of knight-errantry were the cherished delights of the other. But unhappily, political events of recent occurrence had indisposed the Spanish mind to listen to the teachings of Protestantism, and had made the maintenance of their old orthodoxy a point of honor with that people. The infidel Saracen had invaded their country, and reft from them Andalusia, the garden of Spain, and in some of their fairest cities the mosque had replaced the cathedral, and the adoration of Mohammed had been substituted for the worship of Christ. These national humiliations had only tended to inflame the religious enthusiasm of the Spaniards. The detestation in which they held the Crescent was extended to all alien creeds, all forms of worship, their own excepted. They had come to associate with the occupancy of a foreign race and dominancy of a foreign yoke. They had now driven the Saracen out of their country, and torn the standard of the Prophet from the walls of Granada. But they felt that they would be traitors to the sign in which they had conquered, should they renounce the faith, for the vindication of which they had expelled the hosts of the infidel, and cleansed their land from the pollution of Islam. Another circumstance unfavorable to Spain's reception of Protestantism was its geographical situation. The Spaniards were more remote from the papal seat than the Italians, and their veneration for the Roman See was in proportion to their distance from it. They viewed the acts of the Pope through a halo which lent enchantment to them. The irregularities of the papal lives and the scandals of the Roman court were not by any means so well known to them as to the Romans, and even though they had been so, they did not touch them as immediately as they did the natives of Italy. Besides, the Spaniards of that age were much engrossed in other matters. If Italy doted on her past, Spain was no less carried away with the splendid future that seemed to be opening to her. The discovery of America by Columbus, the scarce less magnificent territories which the enterprise of other navigators and discoverers had subjected to her scepter in the East, the varied riches which flowed in upon her from all these dependencies, the terror of her arms, the luster of her name, all contributed to blind Spain, and to place her in antagonism to the new movement. Why not give her whole strength to the development of those many sources of political power and material prosperity which had just been opened to her? Why distract herself by engaging in theological controversies and barren speculations? Why abandon a faith under which she had become great, and was likely to become greater still? Protestantism might be true, but Spain had no time, and less inclination to investigate its truth. Appearances were against it, for was it likely that German monks should know better than her own learned priests, or that brilliant thoughts should emanate from the seclusion of northern cells and the gloom of northern forests? Still, the Spanish mind in the 16th century discovered no small aptitude for the teaching of Protestantism. Despite the adverse circumstances to which we have referred, the Reformation was not without disciples in Spain. If a small, nowhere was there a more brilliant band of converts to Protestantism. The names of men, illustrious for their rank, for their scholarship, and for their talents, illustrate the list of Spanish Protestants. Many wealthy burgesses also became converts, and had not the throne and the priesthood, both powerful, combined to keep Spain Roman Catholic, Protestantism would have triumphed. A single decade had almost enabled it to do so. But the Reformation had crossed the Pyrenees to win no triumph of this kind. Spain, like France, was too powerful and wealthy a country to become Protestant with safety to Protestantism. Its conversion at that stage would have led to the corruption of the principle. The triumph of the movement would have been its undoing. For there was no maxim more certain than this, that if a spiritual cause triumphs through material and political means, it triumphs at the cost of its own life. Protestantism had entered Spain to glorify itself by martyrdom. It was destined to display its power, not at the courts of the Alhambra and Escurial, but on the burning grounds of Madrid and Seville. Thus in Spain, as in many other countries, the great business of Protestantism in the 16th century was the origination of moral forces, which, being deathless, would spread and grow from age to age, till at length, with silent but irresistible might, the Protestant cause would be borne to sovereignty. It remains that we speak of one other country, hedged in with the main, that water-walled bulwark still secure and confident from foreign purposes. England had it very much in her option, on almost all occasions, to mingle in the movements and strife that agitated the nations around her, or to separate herself from them and stand aloof. The reception she might give to Protestantism would, it might have been foreseen, be determined to a large extent by the considerations and influences of a home kind, more so than in the case of the nations which we have already passed in review. Providence had reserved a great place for Britain in the drama of Protestantism. Long before the 16th century, it had given significant pledges of the part it would play in the coming movement. In truth, the first of all the nations to enter the path of reform was England. When the time drew nigh for the Master, who was gone 1400 years before into a far country, to return and call his servants to account, previously to receiving the kingdom, he sent a messenger before him to prepare men for the coming of that great and terrible day. That messenger was John Wycliffe. In many points, Wycliffe bore a striking resemblance to the Elijah of the old dispensation and John the Baptist of the new, and notably in this, that he was the prophet of a new age, which was to be ushered in with terrible shaking and revolutions. In minor points, we trace a resemblance between Wycliffite and the men who filled in early ages a not dissimilar office to that which he was called to discharge when the modern times were about to begin. All three are alike in the startling suddenness of their appearance. Descending from the mountains of Gilead, Elijah presents himself all at once in the midst of Israel, now apostate from Yahuwah, and addresses to them the call to return. From the deserts of Judea, where he had made his abode till the day of his showing unto Israel, John came to the Jews, now sunk in traditionalism and Pharisaic observances, and said, Repent! From the darkness of the Middle Ages, without note of warning, Wycliffe burst upon the men of the 14th century, occupied in scholastic subtleties and sunk in ceremonialism, and addressed to them the call to reform. Repent, said he, for the great era of reckoning is come. There cometh one after me, mightier than I. His fan is in his hand, and he will thoroughly purge his floor, and gather the wheat into the garner. But the chaff he will burn with unquenchable fire. Even in his personal appearance, Wycliffe recalls the picture which the Bible has left us of his great predecessors. The Tishbite and the Baptist seem again to stand before us. The erect and meager form, with piercing eye and severe brow, clad in a long black mantle, with a girdle round the middle, how like the men whose raiment was of camel's hair, and who had a leather girdle upon their loins, and whose meat was locusts and wild honey. In the great lineaments of their character, how like are all the three. Wycliffe has a marked individuality. No one of the fathers of the early church exactly resembles him. We must travel back to the days of the Baptists and of the Tishbite to find his like, austere, incorruptible, inflexible, fearless. His age is inconceivably corrupt, but he is without stain. He appears among men, but he is not seen to mingle with them. Solitary, without companion or yokefellow, he does his work alone. In his hand is the axe. Sentence has gone forth against every corrupt tree, and he has come to cut it down. Beyond all doubt, Wycliffe was the beginning of modern times. His appearance marked the close of an age of darkness and the commencement of one of reformation. It is not more true that John stood on the dividing line between the old and new dispensations than that the appearance of Wycliffe marked a similar boundary. Behind him were the times of ignorance and superstition. Before him were the day of knowledge and truth. Previous to Wycliffe, century succeeded century in unbroken and unvaried stagnancy. The years revolved, but the world stood still. The systems that had climbed to power prolonged their reign, and the nations slipped in their chains. But since the age of Wycliffe, the world has gone onward in the path of progress without stop or pause. His ministry was the fountain-head of a series of grand events, which have followed in rapid succession, and each of which has achieved a great and lasting advance for society. No sooner had Wycliffe uttered the first sentence of living truth than it seemed as if a seed of life, a spark of fire, had been thrown into the world, for instantly motion sets in every department, and the movement of regeneration, to which he had given the first touch, incessantly works its way into the lofty platform of the 16th century. War and letters, the ambition of princes, and the blood of martyrs pioneer its way to its grand development under Luther and Calvin. Thank you all for taking your time to listen to the history of Protestantism. Please like this recording wherever it is that you are listening to it. And as a special favor, I ask you all to go to crosstheborder.org and click on the cover of the volume that you are listening to, which will take you to the appropriate Amazon page. And please leave a 5-star review there and a brief comment about something that you've heard or read in that volume. Thank you so much for taking that little bit of extra time to support us.